The church clock struck 11, and the sound landed in my chest like an accusation. A heavy, deliberate toll, each note dragging through the air like a slow confession. Once that bell had meant everything. A Sunday family dressed in our best, my mother fussing with her hat, my father polishing his shoes until they gleamed like small mirrors. The children, my children, had drifted around us like daisies in spring. Now its tone fell across the pews and found only me, a woman in a lavender-scented dress that had outlived its season, with a rusted key tucked deep into her pocket. They were supposed to be here. My son had promised, his voice strained through the static of distance. My daughter had written a short letter about how she would try, but life is complicated, Mama. My grandchildren had sent flowers, the kind that look alive but never quite smell right. My sister texted a line of sad emojis, her version of sorrow. They said they were on their way. They said they cared. But words are soft currency, easy to spend, impossible to collect. The church smelled of lemon polish and old hymnals. The light from the stained glass spilled down like colored bruises on the floorboards. The minister kept clearing his throat, his voice catching on words he'd written for strangers. And somewhere in the back, a woman cried, not for me, I think, but for the loneliness that echoes through every farewell. On my wrist, a watch ticked, borrowed once from a man I had loved deeply, wound each morning with the same thumb that now trembled against the edge of the pew. The watch had stopped and started again so many times that it had learned to live between pauses, just like me. At my funeral, it kept ticking, defying the silence that swallowed everything else. They left me alone in the end, busy with meetings, with lives polished bright by forgetting. They had reasons, practical, believable, hollow. Time, after all, is a clever liar. It promises return, but delivers excuses. That morning, I learned the shape of my final grief. Not death, but the quiet betrayal of absence. Yet what I held closest to me, what they could not see, was the secret. A small, metallic truth I'd kept locked away for 40 years. The rusted key in my pocket had once opened more than just a door. It had unlocked the one story I swore never to tell. The story that had built and broken my family. The one that made them love me differently without knowing why. I turned it in my hand, feeling its cold weight. Secrets are funny things. You think you're their keeper, but really, they keep you. When the last mourner drifted away, when the ministers began folding chairs and whispering about receptions I would not attend, I finally sat upright and looked at the empty aisle. The church had become a stage after the play was done. The stained glass breathed. The air carried the faintest scent of wax and lilies, and I laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from recognition, not humor, because I realized that for years I had carried this secret like a burden. But now, in this silence, it felt light, almost merciful. People would later say I'd been forgotten, that my family had failed me, but they wouldn't know that the truth was already unfolding, written in ink and sealed in envelopes waiting to be found. Outside, the rain began, soft, polite, almost tender. The clock ticked above me, its sound steady and familiar. I pressed the key deeper into my pocket and closed my eyes. I was not gone, not yet. Something, my secret, was just beginning to breathe. The minister's voice faded. The last candle flickered. And as the final toll of the church clock echoed through the empty hall, I felt the smallest tremor of what was coming. Not an ending, but the start of a reckoning that had waited a lifetime to be heard. There are things in a house that are not heirlooms or decorations, but small altars to the quiet persistence of a life. The kind of life that keeps going even when no one's watching. Mine lived on the top shelf of a cupboard, half hidden behind the sugar bowl and the teacups with the hairline cracks no one bothered to throw away. It was a tin, not a beautiful one, not the kind you'd find in an antique shop polished to nostalgia. No, it was an old biscuit tin, its lid painted with a scene of a green meadow, a cow chewing mid-thought, and a tree that looked too symmetrical to be real. The colors had long since faded from years of being touched, handled, hidden, and rediscovered. But it was honest, in the way old things often are. When I lifted the lid, a faint scent of lavender and metal rose up, a smell that didn't belong to the present, but to the folds of memory. It reminded me of my mother's perfume, of her wrists dusted with flour, of summer mornings when she'd hum while hanging sheets on the line. Beneath that invisible ghost of scent lay the true contents of the tin, a stack of letters tied with a faded red ribbon, several postcards with bent corners, a bottle cap stamped with the word June, a yellowed bill folded twice, and at the bottom, the key that had lived longer than most of my promises. I wound my watch and let the ticking steady me. The letters were a mixture of my handwriting and other hands, some slanted and elegant, others hurried and clumsy. They were the fossils of conversations that had once mattered more than breath. There were letters I had written to my children when they were small, when I still believed words could shield them from the world. There were letters to a man who had been both my salvation and my undoing, whose voice I could still hear when I closed my eyes. And there was one to my sister, written in the lonely winter of 1974, when the silence between us had grown too wide to cross with pride alone. Reading them was not nostalgia. It was anatomy, cutting open the quiet of my life to see what had been living inside it all along. There was a letter, dated January 1986, addressed simply to M. It was written quickly, the ink slightly blurred where I must have pressed too hard or wiped away a tear before it dried. In it, I told him that the small shop we had once dreamed of had failed. I told him that I had used what remained of my savings to buy a new chance, a business venture that didn't have his name but bore his fingerprints. At the bottom, I had added a note that now felt prophetic. I kept the key. Keep it safe. I had meant to tell my children about that key. I truly had. I had pictured a soft afternoon when they'd sit with me, their tea cooling on the table, their eyes curious and gentle. I'd tell them about love, about risk, about how sometimes keeping something locked away isn't cowardice, it's protection. But life never gave us that hour. There were dinners, jobs, heartbreaks, lost dogs, mended marriages. There was never quite enough quiet to explain the kind of silence that had built our lives. So the key remained in the tin, gathering dust as my years gathered around it. When the day of my funeral came, and the minister closed his book with a sigh that sounded too practiced to be grief, I made sure the tin would not go missing. I had it placed beside me, a strange sort of talisman, as if the story it held needed to rest with me one last time before it began again. But the real plan was elsewhere, at the reception table, where people signed their condolences in stiff, looping handwriting. 3 envelopes sat quietly in a stack. One for my son, one for my daughter, one for my sister. They looked innocent, small, polite tokens from a woman now gone. Inside, though, were instructions, short and absolute. At home, after the last of the mourners had drifted away and the kettle sang its lonely song, I sat in my kitchen and spread everything out. The tin, the letters, the key. The afternoon light came in slow and golden, stretching across the table, catching on the ribbon and turning it into something almost holy. I wrote new letters that day, not long, but deliberate. I wrote, I did this for you. Then, I didn't tell you because it would have hurt you, or worse, changed you. And finally, I wanted to keep some dignity in a world that tried to take it piece by piece. The key, after all, didn't belong to a metaphor. It opened a real lock, one to a safe deposit box that had lived quietly in the corner of a forgotten bank for 3 decades. It was registered under a name that wasn't entirely mine, a necessary disguise born from a time when women couldn't own much without someone else's permission. Inside that box was no treasure, no scandal, no diamonds or deeds. Instead, there were papers, receipts from hospital bills I'd paid when my son was too proud to ask for help, deposit slips for the small fund that had saved my daughter's education, and a stack of notes, handwritten and dated, recording every quiet rescue I'd made for them without ever letting them know. I had built my secret like a quilt, piece by piece, patch by patch, sewn from the stubborn hope that my family would someday stand without needing to know how much it had cost me. Why had I hidden it? Perhaps because love, when too visible, begins to look like obligation. Perhaps because I had grown up believing dignity meant silence. Or perhaps because I wanted to be loved not for what I had done, but for who I was when the doing was done. The letters I left after my funeral were not confessions. They were clarifications. Each one carried a map, a key, and a plea. Open the box. Read everything. Don't turn it into shame. Use it well. The last line I wrote was the truest of all. I was lonely sometimes. Forgive me. When I sealed the envelopes, I pressed each one flat with my palm, a small benediction, a mother's last touch. During the funeral's final hours, as people embraced each other over weak coffee and crumbly cake, I moved among them quietly, unnoticed. I slipped a card into my son's jacket pocket, an envelope into my daughter's handbag. The living are too preoccupied with performance, the right tone of sorrow, the right length of silence, to notice the small trembling acts that change everything. By evening, the house was mine again. The teapot was cooling, the light was thin. I placed the tin back on its shelf and hummed an old tune, my mother's tune, something that had outlasted all of us. I thought about what would happen when the letters were opened. I would not be there to see their faces when the truth arrived in neat, folded pages. I would not see the flicker of recognition when they realized the woman they'd thought small had carried an entire world in her quiet hands. But that was all right. Some things bloom best in the absence of their gardener. The cow on the tin's lid caught the late light as I turned off the lamp. I smiled at the way its gaze seemed to meet mine, half amusement, half understanding. The letters glowed faintly under the kitchen light, a constellation of secrets waiting to rise. I pressed the key one last time between my fingers. It was cool, solid, certain. Somewhere beyond me, beyond this small kitchen and the ordinary life it held, the truth waited, patient as time, ready to find the people it had been written for. When I finally closed the cupboard door, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Whatever warmth my secrets would bring, comfort, regret, forgiveness, it was theirs now. And I knew, with a certainty that no church bell could shake, that the family who had left me alone would soon learn they had never been alone at all. Wills are funny documents. They are full of numbers and legalese and paragraphs spaced out like small fields of consequence. People treat them like the map to a treasure they do not want to admit they are searching for. We drafted mine on a Tuesday in a room smelling of carpet cleaner and that matte civic smell of legal office paper. My lawyer, good, precise hands and an eyebrow that worried in the way of someone used to sorting other people's storms, listened and wrote. I told him, plainly, what I had already done. He smiled once, with the tired courtesy of someone who's seen too many family dramas. He asked questions that were procedural and necessary: the accounts, the safe deposit box number, the beneficiary details. He asked me why I was choosing to leave most of my modest savings to a foundation rather than to the immediate family. I did not mind the question, because asking is how people disguise kerchiefs that will mop blood from the face of conscience. For the community center, I said. For the Sunday cooking classes and the youth group that uses the hall. It's a place that fed my children when money was thin. It's a place I trust to feed others. He made a note. He also made a copy of the list of people to be notified and the small clauses that ensured my letters would be read and my key would be used. I made sure, in the way people dress for a wind that will come later, to bind the legal and the emotional. I wanted the instructions to be clear, because ambiguity becomes a battlefield when grief inflames the senses. I wanted it to be a matter of arithmetic, not of argument. I split the safe deposit contents into 3 parts, each going to someone with a history. 1 folded tax receipt and check handed to my son for the business that never quite started, but might still be coaxed alive if given a small seed. Another set of receipts, and a letter of explanation for my daughter to help with the apartment she had been struggling to keep. And a portion, smaller but symbolic, left to my sister. The rest I divided between the community center and a modest scholarship that would carry one child through a year of schooling in a world that keeps tuitions high while expecting patients to afford education. The lawyer raised an eyebrow at the scholarship and wrote, "Anonymity?" I nodded. "Keep my name out of it," I said. "I don't want them to sign my name in a plaque. I want them to teach children to know they are seen, not to know who put the coin on the table." He wrote again, slow and careful, as if he were carving something into granite. The will also contained the oddity that would later be called the Revelation Clause. It was not a dramatic flourish. It was a small, plain paragraph stating that the envelopes placed at the reception and the tin contained instructions to be followed. It requested, in that polite, declarative way of legal writing, that the envelopes be opened within 7 days of the funeral, and that the safe deposit box be accessed with a bank official present. No drama. Only the irons of procedure. I left other things, too. Recipes scribbled in the margin of a page, a pair of earrings to my niece, who had always liked them, and a set of small keys for the violin case that belonged to my late husband, an instrument long out of tune and full of winter dust. These were ordinary bequests for an ordinary life, the small continuities that people love to imagine accompany death. But the thing the lawyer did not fully appreciate was that the legal paper was only the scaffold. The truth would be contained in the letters and the notes, in the margins where my handwriting trembled with confession. I remember the day I signed. It was raining. The world outside the office windows seemed softened by the weather, the city moving through a watercolor wash. I placed my signature across the line like a small finality. There was no hidden flourish, no attempt at dramatics. I could feel the weight of what I had set in motion, like a fruit that had been set to ripen on the branch. I left a copy of the will with the lawyer and another with the bank. I gave the tin to the coffin because I liked the idea of carrying my private ledger down the same path as any other relic of life. When my children arrived at the reception table, after the strings had played and the handshakes had lost their stiffness, my son, who always held his phone like an altar, found the envelope I tucked into his jacket. He felt its weight and smiled because it was a thing men do when given paper. They smile and imagine money. My daughter, searching for a quiet corner, had my other envelope. She patted the foreign inches between the envelopes and the bouquet she carried, not understanding yet the small pile of consequences she would inherit along with my things. The first expectation in life is that family will read the documents we leave them with the same kindness they read our faces in hospital rooms. They will reveal the best of us or the ugliest, depending on their eyes. When the funeral ended and the plates were cleared away by a catering woman with rubber gloves, I watched from a distance and felt certain of one thing: that my small plan would ask my family to see me differently. I think what I wanted most was not to punish them. I wanted to make them aware, gently, inevitably, of the part of my life they had not seen. When the envelopes were opened, which happened at 7 p.m. after the last guest had gone home and the silence had returned to the house like a careful animal, the first paper read, "Dear James, this is to help you restart." The words were simple, practical. There followed a list of accounts, receipts, and the small narrative of how to access the bank box. My son read it and blinked. His first reaction was gratitude and confusion braided together. He looked around the empty dining room, at the chairs like boats moored at shore, and then at his phone, as if the world might offer explanation in a notification. My daughter unfolded hers with less ceremony, then with more. The receipts told a story she knew, but did not comprehend in full. A school payment I had made, an unpaid bill I had cleared in secret, the months I had brought extra groceries without asking. She pressed the paper flat with both hands, and then laughed, a strange, low sound of someone whose grief is suddenly reshaped into understanding. Until that evening, she had thought of my thrift as eccentricity, not intervention. The third envelope, meant for my sister, contained a letter that began, "I'm sorry we stopped talking." It continued with confessions and apologies I had not found the courage to utter in life. She read it with face slack and shoes unfastened, and for a moment, I envied the suddenness of her comprehension. The law office's letterhead and the notary's stamp made it all seem more real, as if the world had put a seal on the truth I'd been sending like a small, persistent bird. The community center called the next day. A woman named Rosa said, with such sweetness that I thought of sugar and coffee, that they would honor my request for anonymity, and that the cooking class would be named Saturday Scones, in recognition of some ordinary kindness that had been offered as lifeline. I had smiled in my head at that image, children and elderly people with flour on their hands, and my name nowhere in the plaque. That was how I had wanted it, my acts to be fuel for others, not an exhibition. Over the next week, there were other calls. My son, angry first, then practical. My daughter, tearful and then focused. My sister, talking for hours across the phone, taking steps toward us blending the past. They were learning the truth, like students of an old map. Some parts were obvious, others needed patience to reveal. There was no immediate fireworks. Life rarely delivers pyrotechnics in matters of debt and deed. But something inside the family settled into new positions, like furniture shifted by sunlight through a window. That was the first payment for the silence I had kept. I had traded surprise for explanation, mistrust for a kind of gentle revelation. It was not the loud justice some might have wanted. It was a series of small corrections that bent the arc of our relationships toward understanding. In the slow, administrative way of wills and lawyers, I had given them not only money, but explanation, a chance to reframe their own histories. Yet there was a deeper, quieter thing I had asked for in that will, not to be mourned for how I died, but for how I had chosen to live. That was the subtlety the lawyer had not noticed in the margin. A request that we remember meals more than memorials, the way my hands had moved over a rolling pin, more than the way my chest had stopped. For some reason, I had felt that the truest legacy I could leave was not a plaque with my name, but a continued circle of people whose bellies were full and whose minds were opened. The days after the will read like reciting an old hymn with new words. My family began to approach me with tentative questions. Practical, yes, but tender in their unfamiliarity. In the way that grief can shape someone into a more attentive listener, they asked about recipes and receipts, about the small ways I had kept them afloat. I answered, line by line, as if I were a teacher going over a lesson they'd missed. The ledger of my hidden life unfolded, not like a scandal, but like a set of tools. There were fights, of course. There were complaints about fairness and whispering about why my sister got a certain receipt and some did not. There was one phone call where my son said, bitter and blunt, "You should have told us when we needed you. Why did you make us find carbon copies in the dark?" I did not argue with that angry voice. I let the silence do my work, because sometimes the quiet is the clearest reply. When the dust settled, it became clear that the will had done something more valuable than redistribute money. It had given my family something harder, the chance to see themselves through my actions and to rewrite the stories they told about me. It had forced them to ask questions they had been too proud or too busy to ask when I was alive. It had also, tenderly, made room for apologies that could be said without the clumsy weight of guilt. I prefer to think the will was a kind of map. Not a map to treasure, but to reconciliation. It told where we had been, where I had put the provisions against bad days, and offered directions for the way forward. It demanded nothing more dramatically than attention and honesty. In my small, practical way, I had used law to nudge the heart. I suppose if one believes in small miracles, this was mine. That paper and ink could soften stubborn human pride into conversations that mattered. Discovery rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment with fanfare and spotlights. It tends to happen in sloping arcs, in the small cracks of ordinary life where patience meets necessity. For my family, discovery came as a set of documents laid out on my kitchen table, and later as a bank clerk's quiet, officious voice that had no idea how loudly its words would ring. They came to the bank on Tuesday because, in their grief and curiosity, they were suddenly efficient. The bank smelled of disinfectant and coffee packets. The clerk, a woman with a bun and shoes that had probably walked more steps than she wanted to count, asked for identification and records. The safe deposit box opened with a clink that sounded much louder than metal warranted. Inside lay envelopes, plastic sleeves with receipts, and a small, creased index card with my handwriting on it, one I had written in the same slanted script I used for grocery lists. The receipts told the practical story first: a payment to the landlady in 1992, a hospital receipt from when my daughter had been ill with a fever at age 12, a tuition check paid to a college's financial office one desperate summer. Plain things, but when listed together, they formed an architecture of care I'd quietly constructed. The more dramatic piece was a list of names, each with a brief note beside it. For rent, for meds, for school. It was a ledger of my family's private scaffolding. My son found his name and read the note aloud, his voice brittle with a complexity of feelings. "You did this, and why?" he asked, a question that was less about the money and more about being wanted in the world that had kept him afloat. My daughter sat on the opposite chair and ran a finger down the column as if she could smooth away the embarrassment. This was, for them, an unveiling. It was proof that someone had seen them when they could not be their own witnesses. And then there was the letter addressed to all, a single page typed on paper that looked older than the bank building's security cameras. It was not long. It outlined where the funds had come from: a small business sale many years before, invested modestly, and why I had kept it secret. The letter said, simply, "I wanted to protect you from shame and to protect myself from pity. I did not want my grandchildren to know their meals cost the pride of a father. I did not want your friends to see handouts. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." They read and read again, the ink a strange comfort. There were gasps and laughter, disbelief that bordered on joy, and a few moments of the rawness that only comes when a person's life has been revised. It was as if a new portrait of me had been painted overnight, my face shifted by light into something their eyes had missed. But the larger discovery, the one that changed the angles of our relationships more significantly, was not the money. It was the list of names that followed the practical receipts: donations to neighbors, funds passed quietly to a woman with a sick husband and 3 children, an anonymous check to a church that fed people after flood season. My family read these with a kind of stunned reverence. They had always known me to be kind, but they had not recognized the scale. In learning about the quiet network of lives I'd kept intact from the margins, they were seeing a portion of my moral geography. They also found one other thing: a small folded photograph of someone they had never met. He was not handsome in the glamorous way of old films, but he had a kind of honest ruggedness, an eyebrow like a crease in the world, hair unruly and eyes steady. I had loved him before they were born, I had loved him enough to name him only by initial in letters. My son looked at the photograph and said nothing. My daughter traced the face with a fingertip, as if she could feel the history in the texture. This other man had been the architect of that early investment. He had taught me to balance a checkbook and encouraged me to save my sodden coins. He had also left before responsibilities made demands, a choice that had left a wound neither my mother nor I dared to probe. The discovery of his photograph changed the story of me in their minds, not because it was scandalous, but because it was human. Humans are not singular beings. We are gardens with many colors. Suddenly my children saw a new plot in my landscape, one that accounted for choices they had not given me credit for. The week after the bank appointment, my son invited his siblings to dinner. They ate slowly, each action deliberate, as if they were retracing the lines of a map. They asked about specific nights, about money turned into meals, about why I had been distant in some conversations while intensely present in others. I answered as best I could in a voice that felt like a thread being mended. I told them I had been proud and protective, fearful of the way charity can humiliate and how reliance can warp independence. I told them I had thought I could save them without asking them to bow to gratitude. It was a complicated confession, but ultimately it was a true one. There was anger, too, an understandable, righteous anger. "Why didn't you tell us?" my daughter asked. And for the first time in years, she sounded like the young girl who used to hide homework under cushions to avoid the evening reading aloud. She had reasons to be resentful. Being kept from knowledge is often a way others exercise control. I was not blind to this. I had made choices that blurred the lines between protection and exclusion. One night, after they'd all left and the house had taken on its accustomed hush, I sat with a cup of tea and looked over the receipts one last time. The watch ticked a slow rhythm, and the photograph in its corner seemed to smile. I thought of the bank clerk, the woman with the bun, how her life would move on with its own small rotations. I thought of the community center and the children who would get a meal because of my anonymous scholarship. There was a warmth in that knowledge, a small flare of triumph that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with the satisfaction of matching action to intent. Grief had softened the edges of everything. The discovery had been less a thunder and more a recalibration. For my family, it was the beginning of a different conversation. They began to tell each other stories of my small interventions, the times a neighbor had suddenly found a check in their mailbox, the ways I had shown up with casseroles and closed my hand before anyone could ask their price. My children started remembering not only what they lacked, but what was there, hidden scaffolding from my hands. Grief had softened the edges of everything. The discovery had been less a thunder and more a recalibration. For my family, it was the beginning of a different conversation. They began to tell each other stories of my small interventions, the times a neighbor had suddenly found a check in their mailbox, the ways I had shown up with casseroles and closed my hand before anyone could ask their price. My children started remembering not only what they lacked, but what was there, hidden scaffolding from my hands. Reckoning is not the same as punishment. It is an accounting of the soul, a line-by-line tally that asks for acknowledgement rather than retribution. For my family, the reckoning arrived like a slow tide. It pulled some things away and left others more visible. I had expected anger and petitions for explanations. I had not fully expected tenderness to arise so quickly in its place. My son, James, began by pacing like a man trying to line up his life with the new facts he'd found. He had been taught to think of men as the breadwinners, though life had complicated that model for him. Finding out that his mother had been the one who quietly steadied their marriage, their home, and the wayward summers of their lives was both flattering and disconcerting. He wanted to understand, and he wanted to step into the role I had held. Except that taking over a role someone had gently designed is like moving into a house where every chair bears the imprint of another's sitting. It will never feel wholly yours. My daughter Lila took more immediate action. She brought the old violin case out of the attic and, with a childlike insistence, decided we needed music in the mornings. She claimed the recipes I had left behind and began to host Sunday breakfasts for neighbors. At first, she did it for the practical reasons, leftovers, company, but I watched it become a ritual that stitched our house back into the fabric of the block. The windows seemed to open wider when Lila's pancakes hit the table, and the cases of loneliness that had once lingered around my threshold thinned like fog under sun. There was conversation, long telephone calls with my sister about the days we had not spoken, nights where confessions flowed like tea from a pot. My sister told stories I had not known, about the time she had hidden an extra pocket of flour so I could bake late at night, about how she had told her own children to accept help when it came, not to measure its shame. In that way, the reckoning did something else. It made hidden webs visible, and people found themselves in threads they had not noticed before. There was one conversation that cut more sharply than the rest. My son accused me, not with cruel words but with raw disappointment. "You made us owe you gratitude," he said. "Now we cannot be sure if our thanks is for what we did or for what we found." I had no neat reply for that. He was right. My secrecy had protected them and, in a sense, controlled how they related to me. The balance between independence and obligation is a delicate one. You cannot hide someone's difficulties forever and expect them to know the fullness of your compassion without consequence. The family meetings that followed were awkward and glorious in equal measure. We sat around my kitchen table, worn and splintered, and we read letters aloud. There were small apologetic gestures, a hand brushed the back of another's neck, a look that asked forgiveness without naming the reason. We told stories of times we had been ashamed and of times we had been proud. In doing so, we indented our relationship with new grooves, places where friction once snagged, now eased. There was a moment I will never forget. My son called his oldest child, my grandchild, a young woman named Mira, into the kitchen and asked her, bluntly, "Did you ever think Grandma was just sitting by, waiting for us to fail?" Mira looked at him and then at me and said, in the clear and honest voice of someone who has not yet learned the nuanced politeness of adulthood, "No, I thought she was strong." Her statement landed like sunlight. The idea that my grandchildren had seen strength in what I did made everything feel less like secret and more like continuity. The small charity I'd left to neighbors and the community center began to circulate stories. Rosa, the woman at the center, called to say they had used the funds to cover a winter shelter for 3 nights for a family who had been sleeping in a car. "You kept us fed," she said, and I could hear her hand on the phone like a caress. The good of it did not inexplicably erase the complexity of a life kept in half-lights. It just made me feel that my choices, however imperfect, had landed where they mattered. We also had to deal with shame, which likes the shadowed corners of human interactions. My daughter, who had always been proud, had to face the idea that pride could turn into something like armor. She cried one afternoon at my table and apologized for being absent in the years when my restraint had been most necessary. "I was busy," she said, "and that's no excuse." She looked older when she said it, as if admitting fault had smoothed the edge of her youth. There were moments of humor, too, because human families are resilient, and because laughter often follows the acknowledgement of pain. My sister told a story about a casserole that had turned out disastrously, and how I had insisted she serve it anyway, adding enough salt to make the whole plate edible. "You were stubborn even then," my sister said, and we laughed, because to be stubborn is a kind of fidelity. The reckoning opened a door to forgiveness, not because the injured party was quick to grant it, but because seeing all the facts made the horizon broader. We were, all of us, more than our mistakes. We had been acted upon by each other's silent decisions, and once those actions were in the light, there was room to reconfigure love to fit the new shape. It did not all boom into harmony, neatly and tidily. There were still things left unsaid, and old hurts that refused to be smoothed by practical papers. But more than anything, the days that followed my revelation were not the hours of violent rupture people sometimes picture in novels. They were afternoons of conversation, mornings of fixing broken fences, nights of gentle confessions. The reckoning was not a thunder, it was a process. In the evenings, when the house settled into evenness and my granddaughter practiced scales on the violin, the sound would travel up the stairs and find me in the kitchen, bent over a recipe. I would remember the quiet before the discovery and recognize how strange it had been to live in a shadow of other people's imaginings. Now, with the truth out, the house felt more honest, worn in places, but utterly my own. At night, I would wind the watch and put the key in a small wooden bowl by the sink. It rested there, like a relic, and sometimes I would take it up and turn it between my fingers, as if I could feel the threads of consequence spin out from it. The reckoning had done its work. It had forced us to reckon with what it meant to love and to be loved. The family who had left me alone at my funeral had returned, different and more attentive, drawn not by obligation alone, but by the clandestine care they had found in the accounts. If forgiveness has a sound, for me it was the clatter of plates as my children began to cook together. There is a type of reconciliation that doesn't come from grand speeches or sweeping proclamations. It comes from the small repetition of kindness. My family, in the months after the discovery, learned to practice forgiveness as one might learn to knead dough, gentle, persistent, and without always knowing where the end will be. We began with meals. Leela insisted on resurrecting the Sunday breakfast club she'd started with a trembling courage. She would call neighbors and friends, and people came with bowls and stories. The kitchen smelled of butter and sugar and something I had learned to call home. My son would arrive and stand by the stove as if the heat could remold him into something softer. They would laugh about things I could only half hear, memories of my scolding for leaving the garden gate open, of the time we misread a medicine label, of our awkward attempts at gardening. There were small rituals of making amends. My son bought a jug of the perfume my mother used to wear and left it on the windowsill, as if scent could create a bridge between generations. My daughter organized a small scholarship in my name, resisting my earlier wish for anonymity, but tenderly making a gesture that matched her character. She argued that the plaque would serve as reminder that generosity has faces, and that those faces can inspire. It was these small, ordinary acts that taught us more than any speech. When my granddaughter Mira came to visit, she insisted I teach her how to make the jam I used to can every summer. We sat together with sugar-sticky hands and jam-stained aprons, and she hummed the same tunes I had once hummed to her mother. Kneading apricots and folding sugar into fruit blurred the gaps between us. She learned the rhythm of waiting for a pot to thicken. We both learned how to tolerate the small, patient works of care. At night, when the house quieted, my son would sit across from me with a book and read passages in the voice he'd used for his children. He'd stumble sometimes, his voice thick with things that had no words. I would listen and let the story be the thing that carried us, because stories are how we explain the unexplainable to each other. With each visit, the bad thread in our tapestry quietly mended, and sometimes it turned into a new, bright stitch. There were awkward conversations, too. My son could not shake the feeling he'd been left by design, not circumstance. He sometimes asked why I'd been secretive. In reply, I would give him an honest answer. I was too proud to ask for help when I needed it, and too afraid to show them my fear. I wanted them to live bravely and not be hampered by guilt or pity. Perhaps it was selfish. Perhaps it was the kind of pride It carries itself like armor. He accepted that, not with complete understanding, but with a willingness to see it as one of my flaws rather than my defining trait. We learned to accept one another's imperfections like weather patterns you can predict but not control. My sister and I exchanged letters, no longer held back by silence. We wrote about trivialities, the cat's new habit of sleeping in the sink, the roosters down the lane, as if building a bridge from inch-long planks. In doing so, we reconciled the long-standing reasons we'd avoided each other, the stubbornness and small jealousies that grow without anyone noticing. We realized that people are messy, loving creatures who nonetheless deserve a second try. Friendships re-emerged, like the green shoots after a frost. Neighbors who had drifted away returned with casseroles, with stories about their own struggles. "We all help each other," said Rosa from the center, who had managed the scholarship distribution with an efficiency that made me admire the world anew. But sometimes people need a nudge to remember their common humanity. Her voice, always practical, had softened in a way that reminded me of summer rain. Even the smallest chore became a form of apology. My daughter fixed a loose stair with care, muttering curses and apologies in equal measure, as if making the house safer might repair what had been worn. She and my son sanded and painted the back fence together, the way people paint walls in an old house they intend to keep. While they worked, they spoke of small things. The favorite number of a child, the precise way my mother used to iron napkins. It was as if the labor itself allowed them to touch the past without wounding themselves. Forgiveness, I came to understand, is less like a present you can hand someone and more like a path you walk together and then choose to widen. We widened it with small acts, phone calls made without agenda, a bouquet left on a windowsill, a phone number checked twice. We widened it by asking questions and listening without being defensive. There were days when the old irritation flared, an aside about a missed birthday, an impatient remark about focus, but these were like flares of a storm, temporary and then gone. There were still nights I felt hollow. I would wake and find the bed empty, and the absence of faces that had once crowded my sleep would ache. I would think back to the scene at the funeral and feel the old, sharp thud in my chest. Then, in the morning, someone would call to ask if I had time for tea, or a child would bring a slice of pie, or a neighbor would drop by with an apology that was not yet needed. Those small visits anchored me back to the world like pegs in a tent. Perhaps the most powerful moment of forgiveness came quietly one morning at breakfast. My son, who had been the most guarded in his emotion, reached across the table and grasped my hand. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. He had carried the burden of being a man with unfinished business, and had assumed my secrecy as another kind of abandonment. I accepted his apology and offered mine in return, for being stubborn, for not telling him when it would have made a difference, for living a life half-hidden. When you have forgiven someone and been forgiven in return, the world looks at you with a kind of mercy. It is not a mercy that erases the past, but one that offers the possibility of living forward. Our house began to fill with the normal music of living, the clink of teaspoons, the shuffle of cards, the murmur of television. These are small things, ordinary, and yet sacred. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing to continue together, despite past pain. We did not try to rewrite what had been. We simply allowed the new knowledge to coexist with the old memory, as if laying a transparent sheet over a photograph so you can read a new note without destroying the original. We became a family that had seen one another plainly and decided to continue loving anyway. Justice arrived without fanfare. It was not a courtroom with gavel strikes, nor a dramatic public humiliation. It arrived like the letter I had hoped would, a small, undeniable correction of the story they told themselves. The community center named the cooking class Saturday Scones, and accepted the scholarship as anonymous at first. But then Leela insisted she couldn't leave the plaque blank. She wanted the young ones to know that an ordinary person could make a difference. If not to inspire, she said, then at least to remind. So the name went up, small and tasteful, in honor of a neighbor's quiet hands. People came to the center and ate and learned to make bread and to count money in ways that made sense. One of the teenagers, a tall boy with fingers stained from greasy hands, told the class he had a dream of opening a diner. The scholarship paid for his first semester in a culinary program. He wrote a thank you letter that Lila read aloud one evening. "I never dreamed someone would see me," he wrote. "I want to make food that makes people feel like home." In that sentence, the purpose of my secrecy dissolved into something purer than grudges and explanations. A young man found a future. My son, James, used his portion to open a small repair shop. Tools, a used van, a sign hand-painted with a letter that sloped like my handwriting. The first day he opened, a neighbor dropped by with a rusted bicycle and a look of hopeful desperation. James took it in and repaired it on the porch, grease on his hands and a grin on his face. There was a small flame in his chest, guarded for a long time. Now, with something to fuel, it burned steadier. And my sister. She took the letter where I had apologized and turned it into a conversation starter. She called relatives and told them the story of the tin. People who had been shy about accepting help began to reach out for what they needed. Aid flowed in greater ease, less wrapped in shame, and more in practical candor. The community, small, stubborn, and marvelous, adjusted its policy of silence and embraced a culture of assistance that didn't ask for public thanks. That, I think, was the quietest triumph of all. At family gatherings, the talk turned less toward recriminations and more toward memories. People told stories that had nothing to do with money. They recalled dances in the kitchen, the bird that once nested in our eaves, the way my mother used to name each day like a person. Monday, you be gentle. In these moments, my life was remembered not as ledger and ledger alone, but as a collage of small, human details. Of course, not everyone was satisfied. There were relatives who, initially excluded from my circle of assistance, felt indignation. They argued that my choices had been arbitrary, that I should have told them and let them decide. This is fair. In a way, my secrecy had made decisions others felt they should have had a voice in. Yet for the most part, people responded with an understanding that surprised me. Even the grumbles softened into conversations about better planning, about how to distribute resources in ways that honor both dignity and fairness. Poetic justice, if anything so quiet can be called poetry, arrived in the form of small, human equilibria. An old neighbor who'd found a check in his mailbox paid it forward by volunteering at the center. A young mother who had been embarrassed by needing help later returned to the center with casseroles in hand and offered a cooking class for single parents. The ripple effects of what I had done, hidden though it had been, began to widen into a circle of care. At the center of this quiet justice was the realization that kindness begets kindness, especially when it's done without strings. People who had once seen charity as censure began to view it as commonwealth. That was the lesson I had hoped for. Not to humiliate the proud, but to teach the community that there is dignity and strength in asking for and receiving help. I confess that part of me thrilled at the justice of it all. Not because I wanted to punish, but because I had felt overlooked and invisible for long stretches. In the end, the truth rearranged the narrative. I had not been a passive, forgotten figure. I had been an active participant in the lives of those I loved. To have that recognized, even indirectly, was a reward I hadn't expected to want. And yet, in receiving it, I felt less like a victim and more like a steward. There were, too, small acts of reparation that had nothing to do with money. My granddaughter began volunteering at the community center, teaching children songs as if she were continuing something someone had taught her. My son and I would walk the garden path at dawn and talk about mundane things: seed packets, the weather, the best way to trim roses. These simple, repeated acts were the currency of mended relationships. Perhaps the most moving sign of quiet justice was the way my family began to speak of me when I wasn't there. People described me with affection, rather than the distance that had made my funeral so empty. They told neighbors that I had been stubborn but fair, that I had a laugh like a bell and an eye for the exact thickness of a stew, memory like a gardener, prunes and nurtures. In the months after everything came to light, my memory was tended with gentleness. There is a strange, small comfort in knowing that when you die, you can still steer a little of what's left behind. I had used that influence to create scaffolding. It felt, in each quiet ripple, like a small victory, that the family who had left me alone at my funeral had, in the end, found their way back through the work I had done in secret. People often think the last gift is money: an envelope slipped across a table, a check written in careful, unshaking handwriting. They think it's the numbers that matter, the neat balancing of accounts between life and death. But my last gift was quieter. It wasn't about payment or closure. It was about permission, the kind I didn't know I'd given, for my family to finally see me, not as the caretaker or the worrier, but as a full, flawed, human soul who had simply tried her best. The days that followed were not tender hymns of peace. They were real, messy, sometimes raw, but honest. My son and daughter fought through years of unspoken tension. Words that had once been too heavy finally broke open. My daughter cried in the kitchen, whispering that she hadn't known how lonely I'd been. My son, proud and stubborn, said little, but when he fixed the hinge on my old cupboard without being asked, it was his way of saying sorry. There were evenings when laughter returned unexpectedly, a crooked, healing sound that made even the cat lift its head and blink in surprise. My sister began writing to me again, letters that smelled faintly of tea and ink, full of old memories and the gentlest kind of regret. And Mira, dear Mira with her jam-stained cheeks and eyes too wise for her years, climbed into my lap one afternoon and asked, "What matters most, Grandma, when everything falls apart?" I told her the only truth I knew: to be kind, to keep an invisible ledger of goodness, debts repaid not with money, but with mercy, to always make sure someone else has a slice of bread before the night closes in. In time, they all began to understand that love does not have to be grand to be real, that the casseroles I'd left at doorsteps, the envelopes of quiet help, the notes signed only, "A friend," those had been my justice. Not punishment or reward, but balance restored through care. My family started to do the same. They looked out for neighbors, sent flowers to the lonely, began to speak softly where they once raised their voices. And so, my secret, the key I had kept hidden, became less a burden and more a bridge. It had unlocked more than a box of papers or a modest fund. It had opened their eyes to a truth I had learned too late. Justice isn't always about getting even. Sometimes it's about giving enough. I hadn't wanted my funeral to be a ledger of regrets. I'd wanted it to be a pause, a breath between lives. And though my family left that church with hearts divided between guilt and confusion, what followed was something finer. They found, slowly, their own ways to finish what I had started. One evening, before my hands failed me, my son lifted a glass at dinner. The wine was cheap, the light was soft, and his eyes were wet. "To Mom," he said, steady but shaking, "who gave so much we didn't know how to count it." My daughter's hand found his. No one spoke for a while. It was enough. When the watch finally stopped ticking and the key was laid to rest beside it, I felt no sorrow, just relief. The kind that comes when you've done all you could with what you had. The letters would be opened. The scholarship would help a girl who reminded me of Mira. The shop would reopen. The garden would bloom. The table would be full again. That was enough. If I could leave one message to those afraid of being forgotten, it would be this: live so that your love teaches others how to love better. Don't hide truths that could heal. Don't mistake secrecy for strength. Money fades, recipes are lost, but kindness, the quiet, deliberate kind, multiplies long after you're gone. My last gift wasn't gold or inheritance. It was a quiet justice, the kind that teaches those left behind that care, once begun, never truly ends. And that, I think, was everything I ever wanted. If you liked this story, subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.